Well, today we're continuing with our exploration of some of the ideas in a book that came out last year called Why Buddhism is True, The Science and Philosophy of Meditation and Enlightenment. That was written by Robert Wright. Today we're going to start delving into one of the more challenging aspects of Buddhism for Westerners, I guess, the concept of anatta. Anatta, that's a Pali word which has been translated as no self. And they say that maybe a better translation of anatta is not self, or perhaps even non-self. It is a central concept in Buddhism, so much so that you really can't call yourself a Buddhist without coming to terms with what anatta means, along with all of its implications. Anatta means that there is no unchanging, permanent self, soul, essence in living beings. That can be a deal killer for anyone with a Judeo-Christian background because it's been drummed into our heads from childhood. I certainly remember this being told over and over again that everyone has this thing called a soul, which existed before we were born and continues to exist after we die. Our immortal soul. Sometimes in my more cynical moments I think about the soul and I think that, well gosh, it was created just so that we can be either rewarded or punished, I guess, so that there's some control over us after we're dead. And I let go of that idea a long time ago. But today, it seems to have escaped the boundaries of Christian thought and made its way into New Age spirituality as well. That's where we find this idea of something that I've heard called a soul contract. You may have heard of it. The idea is that everything that happens to us in life is the result of an agreement or a contract that our soul made before we were born. I don't want to spend much time on that idea today, except to say that there are some really horrendous ethical implications that they never deal with, not to mention the fact that it's sheer speculation. For our purposes this morning, I'm pointing out that Western spirituality and Buddhism really tend to clash over this idea of no soul or no self. It's a non-violent clash, of course, but it's not something that can be shrugged off or explained away. It's a definite contradiction. What exactly does a Buddhist do when they find themselves in a self-service line? Somebody came up with a solution. In the cafeteria there's a self-service line and they added a non-self-service line, which is where you see all the Buddhists. So that might work. Now some folks might argue that, well gosh, if there's no soul, then what is it that gets reincarnated? Because Buddhists do believe in reincarnation, don't they? Many do, not all of them, but the thing to remember with reincarnation is that it's not an essential self that's being reincarnated. It is a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And it's not supposed to go on. It's not a good thing. It's supposed to end, all right? This next one is meant as a joke, but there's more than just a grain of truth here. There's a demonstration being held by some reformed Buddhists. One guy's holding a sign that says, "Don't make the same mistakes twice," and the others are holding a sign that says, "Say no to reincarnation." Stop making the same mistakes twice. The entire goal of Buddhism is to stop the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, because that cycle is called samsara, which means the wheel of suffering that keeps going on and on. So the whole idea is to stop it. The reason for the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth is due to our old friends clinging and aversion. And once the cycle is stopped, according to Buddhist teaching, there's nothing. Nirvana. Nirvana, the word literally means quenching, as if you're pouring water on a flame. to extinguish once and for all. Which is why, if you really get into it, Buddhism can be a bit strange and even scary for folks who have a strong belief in the soul or the afterlife, which is why I'm happy to tell you that we're not trying to turn anyone into Buddhists here. The whole idea behind this book is to stay away from metaphysical speculation about topics like soul and afterlife and things like that. The author tells us that he wanted to find out what aspects of Buddhism are true in the sense that they're supported by scientific research and have a practical application that's going to lead to a better experience in the here and now. In other words, we're more concerned with life before death as opposed to speculating and worrying about what happens after that. This is where it all gets done. So, here's where this book, I think, sheds a lot of light on a challenging concept. The author extends an invitation to us to forget about the idea of no self. Don't get too hung up on it. Don't get too hung up on the idea that the self is an illusion, because we hear some Buddhist teachers say that the self is an illusion. And the problem with calling something an illusion is that we immediately think that what they're actually saying is that it doesn't exist. Now that's just one meaning of the word illusion. The word illusion has several layers of meaning, and one of them is false impression. To say that something is an illusion is to say that we're getting a misleading or a false impression. And when it comes to the concept of self, this is how the author puts it. He says, our intuitive conception of the self is misleading at best. We tend to uncritically embrace all kinds of thoughts and feelings as ours, as part of us, when in fact that identification is optional. Recognizing that the identification is optional and learning through meditation how to make the identification less reflexive can reduce suffering. So that's the idea that he wants to start with. And he's got a chapter in the book which I think has a very clever title. The title is Your CEO is MIA. Your Chief Executive Officer is missing in action, which is sort of a satirical reference to our abbreviation obsessed Twitter culture, OMG, LOL, right? Here's what he tells us. He says, if you think that somewhere inside your head there's a kind of supreme ruler, a chief executive, well, there's some question as to exactly where you would find it. Because we do have this sense that there's something sort of like right behind our eyes that's kind of running the show and sees things and sort of takes this in and wants to put it here, and we do this with it and decide to do that. And throughout history, people who have practiced meditation for any length of time experience something that they call thoughts thinking themselves. Or I think there was another author who actually wrote a book with the title Thoughts Without a Thinker. There's no boss self running the show and thinking the thoughts, and the field of psychology is verifying that. There's no center, there's no locus of control. Just like the meditators, when psychologists do experiments and they can use these functional MRI devices to see what the brain is doing when something is being stimulated or when you're reading something, just when they look for the source of the thought, they don't find anything centralized. It's very diffuse. And that really shouldn't be a problem for us, because when we think about it, what goes on with most of the really important stuff that goes on in our lives from moment to moment? And I'm talking about the most basic and important aspects of living, such as heartbeat, breathing, creating blood cells, digesting food, stuff like that. Do we have to think about it? Do we have a controller that we're aware of that is pulling the strings and pushing the buttons to keep the heart beating? It all happens automatically. We don't have to direct it. We don't even have to think about it. We usually don't even pay attention to it until something goes wrong. I think that's a really good thing. I would hate to have to remember to keep breathing or keep my heart beating from minute to minute. It's getting hard enough to remember the relatively unimportant stuff, right? You're watching TV, the screen goes blank, and you're thinking, oh, what the heck is the security code to my cable channel and stuff like that? You know, I got to go look it up. I got to pull the postcard out that I tucked away someplace. So I'm really okay about giving up control to my autonomic nervous system for all of that stuff. But for the rest of it, for our thoughts and the other actions, we want to maintain this idea of complete control. I'm going to suggest that we substitute the word responsibility instead of control. I mean, let's face it. We think this idea of control is great when it comes to our words, our actions, our thoughts, our decisions. We want to have this rigid control over it. I am in charge. I decided to do this, that, or the other thing. Let's face it, we really don't exercise very good control over the processes that produce our words and actions, especially the ones that cause suffering and harm. How often, here's an example, how often have we wished that we could take something back that we did or said? What does that say about the process that led up to it that we would want to take it back? Oops, I didn't do a very good job at controlling that, or I would have done something different. What kind of control do we really have? We have to admit to ourselves that if we were really exercising the kind of control we think we are, we wouldn't have said and done that in the first place. And yet, we're still responsible for what happened. That's one of those paradoxes. We talked about that last week. It's another Buddhist paradox. We're responsible for what happened and for maybe going back and trying to figure out how we might avoid doing that in the future. So in that sense, there really is a self that we have to control, as in self-control, but again, let's get rid of the word control and say responsibility. Self-control is self-responsibility. We take responsibility for figuring out how the mind and its processes work together. And psychology is telling us that there are multiple processes going on. They work together to produce our actions and our experiences. How do we deal with that so that we can create the best possible experience for ourselves and others? That's the goal here. That's the spiritual practice. And I call it spiritual again because we're dealing with something intangible. Can't put your finger on it, can't locate a spot in the brain that we could do something about. We really can't avoid talking about and using the concept of a self. A big part of it is this simple fact that we have this physical body, or the Zen Buddhists, they use a slightly more crude term for it. They call it the skin bag. That's an interesting one. We have this physical body. We have to navigate through this physical world. We have to keep from bumping into other people and things like that. And we want very much to protect this body. We want to protect it from harm. We want to keep it healthy. We want to keep it safe, and rightly so. You see, the problem is when we try to also protect what we think of as our inner CEO, the thinker of thoughts. The problem becomes when we want to start protecting that because we labor under the mistaken impression, the misleading impression, that it is as real as our physical body. That's where things start to go haywire. Sticks and stones can break my bones. Anyone remember that? Childhood rhyme. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but names can never hurt me. Well, sticks and stones can really break my bones, and the illusory self tries to convince us that names can really hurt us too. That's how it works. When we try to protect the invisible CEO like we're trying to protect our physical body, that's when the trouble really starts. Because we think there is an I that has to protect my beliefs, my opinions. I have to guard my dignity. I have to protect my feelings. I have to guard my sense of pride. I have to, and on it goes. And that's the I. That's the self that we have to either let go of or at least start to loosen our grip on it. That's the real goal of Buddhist practice. And I would also argue that you can find the same thing in Christianity. The biggest problem is that Jesus wasn't around as long as the Buddha to refine and develop these ideas. But you can find this core idea. You know, if we could just get past all the stuff that was piled on top of what Jesus was trying to teach. He had these overzealous admirers who took some simple things and turned it into some just wildly complicated and messy things, but it's really pretty simple. In the Gospels, Jesus is quoted as saying some rather blunt things about the self and taking responsibility for thoughts and thought processes. Here's one example. In the Gospel of Mark, he called the crowd together with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it." Now, there are Christian teachers who have understood this passage in a more Buddhist sense, and one of them was the former Archbishop of Canterbury, this guy, William Temple. He said, "For the trouble is that we are self-centered, and no effort of the self can remove the self from the center of its own endeavor." Yeah, that's very Buddhist, and he understands. It's the self that causes self-centeredness and separation. That's the problem. Archbishop Temple is showing us another paradox. I can't just sit down and say that I've decided to become less self-centered, because the I that sits down to do the deciding is the same self that wants to be protected and stay at the center of attention, and that's how ego works. So you can take this non-self stuff and you can actually turn it into something that is really, really not what they intended. You can take this non-self stuff and you can sit there and practice and say, "Wow, I've become so good at being no self that I'm ahead of all the other students," and stuff like that. You see how that can go. The self runs the show, and it turns it into fodder for the ego. So the more we try to get rid of it, the more egocentric we become. And that bit, I want to go back to that Jesus saying, you don't have to put it up there, Jacob. I just wanted to mention that he talks about taking up a cross, which is just another way of talking about selflessness or non-self, because the ego-dominated person isn't going to want to do anything that might be demeaning, humbling. Sometimes it doesn't even want to do stuff that's difficult or challenging, or it prefers to avoid the obstacle instead of embracing it and using it as a way of moving forward. So picking up the cross just simply means accept the challenge and get on with it. And when he talks about those who try to save their lives will lose it, well, the ego-dominated life is not worth saving, and yet that's the one that we seem to pay attention to the most. That's the one that most human beings are obsessed with. Me, myself, I, mine. Trying to save that leads to giving up a life that's more worth living. That's what the Buddhists are trying to tell us. And again, as I said before, one of the major differences between Jesus and the Buddha is that Jesus didn't live and teach long enough to give us any kind of in-depth, practical instruction on how to go about that. And then his followers messed everything up. But the Buddha did. The Buddha lived a long life, and in that long life, demonstrated that it is a slow and patient process. It's a process of seeing our thoughts without identifying with them and then noticing that there really is no thinker I producing those thoughts, no CEO. Now, we may never have an experience of thoughts without a thinker. And the author encourages us to not worry about that. It's not a problem. There may always be this sense of self that lingers. And if we let that be an obstacle to practice, guess who wins? Here's some practical advice to close with. He tells us, think of yourself as having, in principle, the power to establish a different relationship with your feelings and thoughts and impulses and perceptions. The power to disengage from some of them. The power to, in a sense, disown them. To define the bounds of yourself in a way that excludes them. Think of some degree of liberation as being possible. And don't worry about the fact that this would seem to imply that there is a self to be liberated. There are worse things than being a self that gets liberated. That's good stuff. Disengage, redefine what we think of as the self so that we can become less self-centered. Sounds like a small thing, but it's not. In the words of the song Imagine, imagine what it would be like if lots and lots more people got that and reached that point. All right, that's enough for today. Next week, we're going to shift gears a little bit because it's the day before Charles Darwin's birthday, and I want to talk about what Darwin has done for us lately, and then we'll pick up with the Robert Wright book after that. So we'll see you next time. Thank you.